The Law of Dependent Arising, the Secret to Bondage and Release. Sermon 7 by Bhikkhu Ñāṇananda. Narrated by Bhikkhu Candana. Sermon 7. Pahankanua Sermon number 189. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Homage be to the Fortunate One, the Worthy, fully enlightened. Anattani attamaning passalokang sadevakang. Nivitthang namarupasming idang sacchanti manyati. Yena hi manyati tato tang hoti anyatha. Tang hi tassa musahoti. Mosa dhammang hi ittarang. Amosa dhammang Nibbānaṃ. Tadariya saccato vidu. Teve saccabhi samaya. Niccata parinibbuta. Dvayatānupassana sutta nipāta. Just see a world with all its goods, fancying a self where none exists. Entering into name and form, it builds the fancy, this is the truth. In whatever way one fancies of a thing, thereby itself it turns otherwise, and that itself is the falsity in it, falsifying by nature the puny thing. But Nibbāna, unfalsifying as it is, noble ones knew as the truth, and they, by their understanding of the truth, are hungerless and fully appeased. Dear listeners, the fully enlightened Buddha has revealed to us that the worldlings are bound to samsara due to the conceit that there is a self where there is no self. The fancying or imagining caused by conceit is called mannyana. The release from this imagining, which takes name and form as the truth, is the release from the bondage of Mara, that is to say, Nibbāna itself. Today we have taken up as the topic of our sermon 3 verses which declare this truth. These 3 verses also are found in the Dvayatānupassana Sutta of the Sutta Nipāta. In our last sermon, we introduced this discourse as one that instills an intense fervor of the Dhamma. As the word Dvayata in the title of the discourse indicates, this sutta analyzes 16 topics of Dhamma in the form of dualities. Here the Buddha analyzes in 16 ways the eternal law of bondage and release, in a way that reminds us of the direct and the indirect order of the law of dependent arising. Today we have taken up for comment the 3 verses pertaining to the 15th mode of contemplation of dualities. As an introduction to those 3 verses, the Buddha gives this prose description of the 15th mode of duality. Yang bhikkave sadevakassa lokassa samarakassa sabrahmakassa sassamana brahmaniya pajaya sadeva manussaya idang sacchanti upanijjhayitang tadamariyanang etang musati yathabhutang sammapanyaya suditthang ayang ekanupassana. Monks, whatever that has been pondered over as this is true by the world with its gods, Maras and Brahmas, with its recluses and Brahmins, that by the audience has been seen as it is with right wisdom as that is false, This is one mode of contemplation, and the second mode of contemplation is introduced as follows. Yang bhikkhave sadevakassa lokassa samarakassa sabrahmakassa sassamana brahmaniya pajaya sadeva manusaya idang musati upanijhayitang tadamariyanang etang satchanti yathabhutang sammapanyaya suditthang ayang dutiyanupassana. Monks, whatever that has been pondered over as this is false by the world with its gods, maras and brahmas, with its recluses and brahmins, that by the Aryans has been seen as it is with right wisdom as that is true. This is the second mode of contemplation. Having thus presented the two modes of contemplation, the Buddha, as he did in the case of other contemplations, declares that if any monk, rightly contemplating in this way, dwells diligently, ardent and zealous, one of two fruits may be expected by him: knowledge of arahanthood in this life itself, or, if there is any residual clinging, non-returnership. The Buddha declares that this particular contemplation is so highly beneficial. It is after this declaration that the Buddha summed it up in these 3 verses. Anattani attamaning passa lokang sadevakang nivitthang namarupasming idang satchanti manyati. See the world with all its gods entertaining a conceit of self where there is no self, having entered into or entrenched in name and form, it loves to fancy this is the truth. With that, the Buddha is stating the condition of the world, and then he says, Yena yena hi manyati, tato tang hoti anyatha, tang hi tassa musa hoti, mosadhamman hi ittarang. In whatever way one fancies a thing, thereby it becomes otherwise. That itself is the falsity in it, the puerile, deceptive thing that it is. Then the 3rd verse. Amosa dhammang Nibbānaṃ tadariya satchato vidu teve satchabhisamaya niccata parinibbuta. Nibbāna is unfalsifying. That the wise ones knew as the truth, and they, by their understanding of the truth, being hungerless, are fully appeased. So, from these words of the Buddha, it is clear that the entire world, including gods and brahmas, are caught by this bondage of Mara, due to fancying by taking name and form to be real. This fact is borne out by the parable of Vepacitti we brought up in our last sermon. Just briefly remind yourselves of what we have related the other day. The Buddha, once addressing the monks, related the age-old legend of the battle between gods and demons. He said that demons lost and gods won in this particular battle, and the gods bound Vepacitti, the king of demons, in a 5-fold bondage, i.e., neck, hand, and foot, and brought him before Sakka, the king of gods. This bondage had a peculiar mechanism about it. If Vepacitti thought, demons are unrighteous, gods are righteous, I will remain in the Deva world, he would find himself freed from that bondage and enjoying heavenly pleasures. But if he happened to think, gods are unrighteous, demons are righteous, I will go back to the Asura world, then he finds himself bound again in that 5-fold bondage. After stating that, the Buddha goes on to say, so subtle, monks, is the bondage of Vepacitti, but more subtle still the bondage of Mara. And then he explains what this bondage of Mara is. The Buddha declares that even the basic postulate of existence, namely the notion I am, is an imagining. Asmiti bhikkave manyitametam. There the Buddha mentions a ninefold imagining. The notion I am is an imagining. This am I is an imagining. I shall be is an imagining. I shall not be is an imagining. I shall be one with form is an imagining. I shall be formless is an imagining. I shall be percipient is an imagining. I shall be non-percipient is an imagining. I shall be neither percipient nor non-percipient is an imagining. Thus, the entire gamut of existence, extending up to the realm of neither perception nor non-perception, including the sensuous realm, the realm of form, and the formless realm, is the range of imagining. Having declared that existence as a whole is bound up with imagining, he says in conclusion, imagining, monks, is a disease. Imagining is an abscess. Imagining is a barb. Manyitang bhikkave rogo. Manyitang gando. Manyitang sallang. And advises the monks to dwell with a mind free from imaginings. Amanyitamyanena cetasa. By means of the 5 constituents of name, that is to say, feeling, perception, intention, contact, and attention, the wordlings take hold of the 4 great primaries, namely, earth, water, fire, and air, and due to self-love, enact a drama of narcissistic affection, best exemplified by the story of Narcissus itself, which we brought up several times. The handsome Greek youth Narcissus, who had never seen his own face, while wandering in a forest, bent down into a pond to wash his face. Seeing the reflection of his own face, he mistook it to be an angel's and tried to embrace her. Every time he tried, the ripples foiled his attempt. If we bring this story in line with the point at issue, as soon as the wordling imagines a thing, it turns otherwise. To fancy a thing is called thisness, and the ripples of impermanence is its otherwiseness or change. For instance, now we take this clock as a thing. When it goes out of order, it turns into otherwiseness. If we had not taken it as a thing, but as part of a heap of rubbish, such a situation would not have arisen, because there is no fancying. That is only by way of illustration. Through all this, the Buddha puts across to us the truth of impermanence. In our last sermon, we presented a deeper analysis of this truth. It is a very powerful sermon. Soon after his enlightenment, the Buddha surveyed the world with his Buddha eye, and seeing how beings are afflicted with lust, hate, and delusion, came out with an inspired utterance, which is a wonderful blend of prose and verse. Let us quote a portion of it. Ayang loko santapajato passapareto rogang vadati attato. This anguished world, given over to contact, speaks of a disease in terms of a self. And then he says, Yena hi manyati tato tang hoti anyatha. Whatever one thinks in terms of, thereby it turns otherwise. Now comes the extraordinary statement. Anyatha bhavi bhavasatto loko bhavapareto bhavameva bhinandati yada bhinandati tang bhayang Yassa bhayati tang dukkhang bhava vippahanaya ko panidang brahmacharyang vussati. The world attached to becoming, given over to becoming, though becoming otherwise, yet delights in becoming. What it delights in is a cause for fear. What it is afraid of is suffering itself. For abandoning this becoming is this holy life lived. What is called existence has in it the nature of turning otherwise. To that existence which has the nature of turning otherwise, worldlings are attached. They are enslaved by it, and they delight in it. But that delighting is dangerous and fearful. Why? Because the existence they take as thisness is turning otherwise. It is inevitable. So this is the actual situation in the world. That is why the term mannyana is of so fundamental an importance in this Dhamma. Well then, one can ask, where lies freedom? We said that in imagining or fancying one conceives of a thing. We all know that there are 6 senses. The 5 external senses are eye, ear, nose, tongue, and body. When the objects taken in by these 5 senses reach the mind, they take on a different mold. All objects of the mind are called Dhamma, things. So you may note, first of all, that the problem concerns those things that come to the mind. About this thing which is the object of the mind, there is a highly significant discourse in the Majjhima Nikāya, namely Mūla Pariyaya Sutta. It is probably because of its fundamental importance that those Arahants who held the first council placed this discourse as the very first in this discourse collection. But unfortunately, nowadays teachers, when they teach this book to their pupils, ask them to skip the first sutta and start from the second. They say that this is so abstruse that even those who listened to it could not understand it. But we wish to point out that this discourse is like the basic alphabet to the understanding of the philosophy of this entire Dhamma. Why do we say so? Because this Mūla Pariyaya Sutta reveals the basic pattern of all things that occur to the mind. Mūla Pariyaya. Let us now describe the way this discourse is presented. It has a very brief introduction. The Buddha, seated under a sala tree in the Subhaga forest in the Ukkaṭa, addressing the congregation of monks, preached this sermon, presumably because he wanted to bring up a very important subject. He introduces the subject with this exhortation. Sabbadānaṃ mūla pariyāyaṃ vo bhikkhave desissāmi. Tang sunātha sādhukaṃ manasikarotha bhāsissāmi. Monks, I shall preach to you the fundamental mode of all things. Listen to it. Attend to it well. I shall preach. What is meant by the fundamental mode of all things is this. There is a certain mode according to which all phenomena occur to our mind. It is this basic mode that is found in grammar. Within this linguistic usage, all phenomena that occur to the mind present themselves according to some grammatical pattern. In regard to that grammatical pattern, this Mūla Pariyaya Sutta analyzes the respective attitudes of the average worldling uninstructed in the Dhamma, of the monk who is a learner not attained to arahanthood, of the Arahant, and of the fully enlightened one, the Tatargata. But we can boil it down to 3 attitudes, since the attitude of the Arahant and of the Buddha are essentially the same. Because the Tatāgata, the fully enlightened one, proclaimed this Dhamma as the teacher, he is in a category by himself. But for all practical purposes, his attitude and that of the Arahant are the same. So we are now going to analyze this discourse based on those three attitudes. We have already mentioned that this discourse describes the attitude of the worldling towards the grammatical pattern in usage in the world, the attitude of the learner training in this Dhamma, and the attitude of the Arahant. To present all objects of the mind regarded as things, the Buddha lists 24 Dhammas. It is not a complete list of all possible Dhammas, but a fair representation of them as instances. They may be summed up as follows in brief. Firstly, the four great primaries, earth, water, fire, and air. Then, the 8 classes of beings, namely, beings, gods, Pajapati, Brahma, the radiant ones, the lustrous ones, the Vehapala Brahmas, the overlord. Then the 4 formless realms, the realm of infinite space, the realm of infinite consciousness, the realm of nothingness, the realm of neither perception nor non-perception. Then the sum total of sense experience, the seen, the heard, the sensed, and the cognized. And finally, the concepts of unity, diversity, universality, and Nibbāna. Ekatang nanatang sabbang Nibbāna. Having thus introduced 24 mind objects, Dhamma, the Buddha describes the different attitudes of the above 3 classes towards each of them. When we give one instance, you all can understand the rest of it. Out of the 4 primaries given first, let us take earth. This is how the attitude of the uninstructed average worldling towards it is described. He perceives earth, even as the deer perceives water. Having thus perceived earth as earth, pataving patavitu sanyatva, he imagines an earth, pataving manyati. There we find that manyana coming in. Then he imagines, in the earth, pataviya manyati. He imagines from the earth, patavitu manyati. He imagines, earth is mine, pataving meti manyati. He delights in earth, pataving abhinandati. Then the Buddha asks, why is that? Tang kissa hetu, and gives this explanation. It is because it has not been comprehended by him. Apariññātaṃ tassāti vadāmi. Then about the learner, K, who has not attained arahanthood. This is what comes in the discourse. Pataving patavito abhijanati. In this case, it is not sanjanati, perceives, but abhijanati, i.e., understands through higher knowledge. Through his attainment of the fruit of the path, even for a split second, he had an experience of the truth, as if by a streak of lightning in a dark night. He had a glimpse of Nibbāna. Thereby he got an understanding which is of a higher order than mere perception. He has understood the true state of affairs, though it is short of full comprehension. About him, this is what is stated in the sutta. Pataving patavito abhijanati. He understands earth as earth. And then, pataving patavito abhiññāya. Having understood earth as earth, now comes a peculiar expression. Pataving ma manyi, pataviya ma manyi, patavito ma manyi, pataving meti ma manyi, pataving ma abhinandi. The use of ma here is a big puzzle for the commentator, but it is the prohibitive particle in Pali language. You may have heard the dictum, ma nivatta abhikkama. Do not turn back, go forward. However, the commentator goes off at a tangent here. He says that this particle conveys the idea that the noble disciple neither imagines nor does he not imagine. This is not the reason for this peculiar usage. The learner, seika, is that noble disciple who is still training. Though he has higher knowledge beyond mere perception, he has not yet attained full comprehension, pariññā. So he has to constantly remind himself to refrain from imagining, drawing inspiration from the higher knowledge he has won. Pataving ma manyi, etc. means do not imagine earth as earth. Do not imagine in the earth. Do not imagine from the earth. Do not imagine earth is mine. Do not delight in the earth. Why? Because he has yet to comprehend. Pariññayaṃ tassāti vadāmi. This is an injunction for self-training. Well then, that is as far as the noble disciple who is a learner is concerned. Now, as for the attitudes of the Arahant and the Tatargata, we said that they are the same. For instance, this is what is said about the Arahant. Pataving patavito abhijānati, pataving patavito abhiññāya, pataving na manyati, patavya na manyati, patavito na manyati, pataving meti na manyati, pataving na bhinandati. That is to say, the Arahant, as well as the Buddha, has the following attitude towards the concept of earth. The Arahant, by virtue of his higher understanding of earth, has seen its voidness. He does not imagine earth as earth. He does not imagine in the earth, does not imagine from the earth, does not imagine earth is mine, does not delight in the earth. We said that there are 24 concepts listed. With regard to each of them, the same mode of imagining is given in detail. What is said, in particular about the Tatāgata, the fully enlightened one, is that he is the teacher who revealed this Dhamma. In conclusion, the Buddha says, Nandi dukkhassa mūlanti iti viditva bhava jati bhūtassa jara maranaṃ. Having known that delight is the root of suffering. From becoming, birth, and to the one born there is decay and death. That is why there is no delighting in any of those concepts. Nandi dukkhassa mūlaṃ. Delighting is the root of suffering. It is by delighting that an existence comes to be, and that existence is turning otherwise. That is the beginning of suffering. Birth, decay, and death, and all the rest follow. By way of explanation of this discourse, we may cite the simile of the deer and the mirage. We have brought up this simile quite often. The deer imagines water in the mirage and runs after it. But if a person knows that it is not water but some seasonal phenomena, even if he thinks at first sight that it is water, he tells himself, No, this can't be water, and trains himself. One who has full comprehension does not have to advise himself, because he has perfect knowledge. The commentator has confounded the whole issue. He cannot appreciate the fact that it is a step of training. But confusion is worst confounded when he comes to explain the last of all 24 concepts, namely Nibbāna. When it is said that one should not delight in Nibbāna, quite understandably the question comes up, if we don't delight in Nibbāna, how can we attain it? That may be the reason why the commentator says that Nibbāna here mentioned is not our Nibbāna, but the concept of Nibbāna in other religious systems. With this observation, the commentator makes an attempt to vindicate our Nibbāna, despite the fact that the Buddha has here leveled an attack on linguistic usage as a whole. But it is a vain attempt, because as long as one goes on imagining in terms of Nibbāna as in Nibbāna, from Nibbāna, and so on, as long as one delights in the concept of Nibbāna, one cannot attain it. Some of you might take it as an awkward position. We all look forward to attain Nibbāna. So, if we cannot delight in Nibbāna, what else can we delight in? This is the problem for commentators too. But here we have something deep concerning linguistic usage. To explicate it a little, let us give an illustration from the history of this dispensation. In an earlier sermon, too, we have mentioned to you, in brief, some incident recorded in the annals of the history of Buddhism. After the Buddha's demise, when the time came for the holding of the first council, Venerable Mahakassapa Mahatera was faced with a problem in selecting 500 Arahants for the recital of Dhamma and Vinaya. It was Venerable Ñāṇananda who had committed to memory the entire Dhamma, but he had not attained Arahanthood yet. Therefore, 499 Arahants were selected at first. They were in a dilemma whether to take in Venerable Ñāṇananda or not. However, at last they decided to take him on the ground that he is incapable of being influenced by prejudices. It is said that on the day before the council, the Arahants reminded Venerable Ñāṇananda of his obligation, saying, "Friend, tomorrow is our council. It does not behove you to attend it as a non-Arahant. Be diligent." Those of you who have passed examinations would remember how much you have crammed when you are reminded that tomorrow is the exam. Similarly, Venerable Ñāṇananda too made a firm determination to put forth his best efforts. It is said that he determined thorough mindfulness in regard to the body, kaya gata sati, and spent the greater part of the night in the promenade, pacing up and down mindfully. Probably due to tiredness, in the last watch of the night, he thought of taking some rest, and went and sat on his bed. He was going to lie down. His feet were raised from the floor, and his head had not reached the pillow yet, and in the interim his mind was released from all influxes, and he attained Arahanthood. Various explanations are given about this extraordinary illumination between two postures. The commentator says that Venerable Ñāṇananda thought, "Now I am striving too hard. Let me balance my spiritual faculties." That can't be the reason. There is a subtle psychological norm involved here. Now, for Venerable Ñāṇananda, the concept Nibbāna appeared as a certificate to enter the council. That is to say, for him, Nibbāna was something like a certificate. The word Nibbāna, which stands for giving up everything, became a thing to be grasped. I must attain Nibbāna. It is beneath my dignity to attend the council as a non-Arahant. There itself is conceit and restlessness due to overexertion. He imagined Nibbāna to be a thing, and that implies ignorance as well. That is why he could not attain Nibbāna after all that striving. But then, what happened at that particular moment? He had already determined on strenuous effort in all four postures. So, if he had lied down on bed, he would have continued to put forth strenuous effort. But there is something called posture junctions. Most probably, he had reckoned without them. However, at that interim instance of bending his body to lie down, he suddenly became aware of an interval. In that interval, it might have occurred to him, "Oh, I have made a thing out of Nibbāna. Isn't it a term for giving up everything? So why am I struggling?" In that moment of realization, he realized Nibbāna and became an Arahant. That is our explanation. On an earlier occasion, too, in the course of our sermons, we gave various similes by way of explanation. Even if you are driving in a hurry, when you come to the crossroads junction, you have to slow down. Likewise, Venerable Ñāṇananda found a brief interval at a posture junction. That is probably how he attained Nibbāna. So there is nothing to take delight in Nibbāna, because to do so is to perpetuate the subtle notion of I and mine. But still, you may have doubts. So, let us bring up an illustration from our village life. Our National New Year Day is drawing near. Isn't that so? Now, among the New Year festivities, there is a game called Blind Man Cracking the Pot. Though we have no pots here, we shall give a simile somewhat closer to it. You all have seen the artistically painted words on the wall at the far end of this hall. Nibbānaṃ paramang sukhang. Nibbāna is bliss supreme. After all, isn't that our aim? Nibbāna is the supreme bliss, and Nibbāna is over there on the wall. Now, supposing I blindfold a young upasaka in this crowd and ask you all to get to a side to make way for him and ask him to turn towards that Nibbāna. Of course, he cannot see it, as he is blindfolded. Then I ask him to do as I say. Take a step towards it. Take another step, another step, another step. You all are now watching. He comes up almost against the wall, step by step, but he doesn't see it. And then I say, take another step. What happens then? When he lifts his foot, he finds that he has to turn back. This is a simile for you to ponder over. Sankhara, or preparations, have been associated with the simile of the pot. If you can understand this, perhaps you can crack the pot of sankhara and attain Nibbāna. The moral behind our simile is that Nibbāna, as a term, is a target not to be grasped, but to be seen through. It is a question of penetration. At last, you have to let go of it and free the mind of imaginings about it. What do we mean by turning back at the last step? You may recall the lesson we taught by getting you to count on your fingers. While explaining the 5 representatives of name in name and form, nama rupa, the 5 fingers are feeling, perception, intention, contact, and attention. Vedana, sanya, cetana, phassa, manasikara. Contact is the nearest to attention, even as the index finger is to the thumb. Contact, as the index finger, is the troublemaker. The index finger, contact, is always fussy and busy with the thumb, attention. So let us now pay more attention to this attention, manasikara. We have analyzed it in various ways while discussing the middle path tactic by which the Buddha discovered the magical illusion behind consciousness. There we made use of a certain simile. Sometimes in courts of law, a case of murder or theft would come up with no one to give evidence. When there are no other witnesses, there is provision for making one of the alleged culprits the crown witness to get the whole story out. We pointed out that the Buddha had to do a similar thing. Out of the 5 representatives of name, nama, it was attention, manasikara, who brought us all this way in samsara in the guise of non-radical attention, ayoniso manasikara. It is due to this wrong attention that the deer keeps running after the mirage, imagining water over there. Now, the Buddha converted this non-radical attention to radical attention, yoniso manasikara. What does yoniso mean? Yoni is matrix, or place of origin, and yoniso means by way of the place of origin. So, yoniso manasikara could be rendered by the term radical attention. The Buddha asks us to turn back and pay attention to the source or origin. The deer ran after the illusion of water, misled by prolific conceptualization or papancha. The worldling is in the same situation. With the change over to radical attention, the meditator lets go of papancha, cuts off vitakka, thought, gives up sanya, perception, frees himself from the grip of vedana, feeling, and finally comes back to phassa, contact. That is the moment you are up against the wall. If we analyze the word manasikara, manasi means in the mind, and kara is doing. So manasikara is an activity within the mind. As a matter of fact, it is this guy, manasikara, who is responsible for the conspiracy that is samsara. Manasikara is an activity going on in our mind. We do not understand it as it is. The object used for this activity within the mind we put before it. But the actual state of affairs the Buddha has made known to us through the maxim in the 2 opening verses of the Dhammapada. Mano pubbangama dhamma mano setha manomaya. Mind objects have mind as their forerunner. Mind is their chief. They are mind-made. The worldling thinks otherwise. He argues from the other end. If he writes a Dhammapada, he would put it the other way around. Dhamma pubbangamo mano. Mind has mind objects as forerunners. But the Buddha points out that the mind is the forerunner, and that things are mind-made, manomaya. Venerable Ñāṇananda finally realized that the term Nibbāna is mind-made, that it is only a target, symbolic of complete relinquishment. You may have heard a number of terms denoting Nibbāna. Sabba sankhara samato, sabbupadhi patinisaggo, tanhakhayo virago nirodho Nibbāna. The stilling of all preparations, the relinquishment of all assets, the destruction of craving, detachment, cessation, extinction. Any one of these terms is sufficient to denote that attainment. Now, sabba sankhara samato means the stilling of all preparations. To think, I must somehow get this certificate of Nibbāna as a qualification to go to the council is a sankhara, a preparation. The thought, I must go, is also a preparation. So then, preparations are not yet stilled. Sabbupadhi patinisaggo, relinquishment of all assets. The thought, I must take this bundle of 5 aggregates and get it seated at the council, shows that all assets are not relinquished as yet. Craving is also implicit in such a wish. Nibbāna implies a letting go of everything, an extinction. But the worldling grasps it as a term. That is why we say that the world is steeped in the delusion inherent in the linguistic medium. The Buddha has clearly pointed out to us this deluding trait in linguistic usage. But our commentators, as well as many Buddhist sects, have not fully understood his enlightened vision regarding language. Due to that lack of understanding, they inclined to the same self-view. But here we highlighted the role of attention, manasikara. The object for the mind is Dhamma, the thing. In this context, the mind object is Nibbāna. What happens with the sudden realization that it is only a word? Mind consciousness immediately goes down objectless. We have already said that consciousness, by definition, is a discrimination between two things. Now, if the mind object is seen as something created by the mind itself, manomaya, how can one discriminate between two things? Simultaneous with the realization that what had so far appeared as the object of the mind is mind-made, there comes a moment of non-discrimination. Mind consciousness ceases then and there. Try to understand this deep point. Granted that consciousness is a discrimination between two things, the moment that the deer becomes conscious of water in a mirage, it thinks, "There is water over there, and I am here." That means there is a gap, an in-between the two. So now we come back to the same story of two ends and the middle. Where there are two ends, there is a middle. The deer thinks, "Here I am, and water is there. Once I pass through the intervening gap, I can reach that water." That is the way the world thinks. The object is given precedence. It is projected when one thinks, "I am here, and the object is there." However, the Buddha points out to us quite a different way of thinking. Not the imagining or fancying a thing as implied by Manjana. To hark back to the Mulapariyaya Sutta, the worldling makes a thing out of earth, Patavi. Not only earth, water, fire, and air, but all the 24 concepts listed there under the heading Sabbadānaṃ Mulapariyaya, the basic mode of all things, are not to be taken as objects for Manjana, not even gods, beings, Pajapati, and Brahma. The Buddha tamed even Brahma Baka, who boasted of his permanence. Simply because of their long lifespan, Brahmas entertained the conceit, "We are eternal." The ascetic Bahya Daruchiriya went through the necessary discipline within a very short time. He was able to stop short at the seen in the seen. But we do not stop there. Instead, we make, for instance, a chair out of the scene, so that we can sit on it. Similarly, we do not stop short at the heard, but make a music out of it. That way we make a thing out of our sensory experience. It is due to this conceiving of things that we linger long in samsara. As soon as we imagine a thing, the ripples of impermanence take over. The inexorable consequence is the turning otherwise. There lies the tragic end of this drama of existence. The moment one makes a thing for oneself, it starts becoming another thing. As in our illustration of the love scene enacted by Narcissus, throughout samsara we have been grasping something or other with self-love at the last moment of our life. That is the reason for the perpetuation of mutual interdependence between name and form and consciousness inside a mother's womb. But then one can ask again, if I cannot take delight in Nibbāna, what is the use of it? It may even seem useless to attain Nibbāna. If it is not good to delight in Nibbāna, after all the trouble we take to attain it, one can ask, what is the purpose in attaining it? A deity named Kakudha also had the same problem, according to a discourse in Samyutta Nikāya. When the Buddha was dwelling at the deer park in the Anjana forest, a deity named Kakudha approached him in the night and asked, "Recluse, do you rejoice?" The Buddha retorted, "On getting what, friend?" Then the deity asked, "If that is so, recluse, do you grieve?" "On losing what, friend?" asked the Buddha rhetorically. "Well then, recluse, you neither rejoice nor grieve," said the deity, and the Buddha affirms it, saying, "That is so, friend." The deity was also curious to know whether the Buddha is dissatisfied with the monk's life, as he is sitting all alone, now that he says that he neither delights nor grieves. The Buddha responds with an instructive verse. Agha jātassa ve nandi, nandi jātassa ve agham, anandi anigho bhikkhu, evang jānahi marisa. Joy is for him who is stricken with grief, and grief is for him who becomes joyful. But as for a monk, friend, know this as a fact. He is neither joyful, nor does he grieve. What the Buddha means by this is the bliss of equanimity, free from joy and grief. In fact, as you know, Nibbāna is even called avedayita sukha, a bliss free from feeling, since all three grades of feeling are in the highest sense reckoned as suffering. Even from this brief comment, you may understand that Nibbāna is not something to be grasped. It is only a target to reach, not to be grasped. In one's striving for it, at last one reaches a stage which is something like a going topsy-turvy. The ultimate realization is a sort of turning upside down. That is why even the non-returner, anagamin, is said to have attachment and delight in the Dhamma. Dhammaraga Dhammanandi, as a residual taint to be eliminated. It is true that he has Nibbāna uppermost in his mind, but there is a subtle attachment to it that prevents him from ending samsaric suffering here and now, and gives him rebirth in the pure abodes, suddhavasa. By that very attachment and delight, teneva dhammaragena taya dhammanandiya. That attachment and delight is the last thing to be given up, since the Buddha has declared that this Dhamma is only for the purpose of crossing over and not for grasping. Nitharanataya no gahanataya, even like a raft. Similarly, the Buddha has preached that by those who fully understand, even good things or mind objects have to be given up. What to say of bad things? Kullu pamang vo bhikkave dhammang desitang ajanante hi dhamma pivo pahatabba pageva adhamma. Now, Nibbāna as a term is something pertaining to Dhamma. Even that has to be given up at some juncture. The reason is that we use language only out of some practical necessity. It is not something to be grasped. The moment we grasp it, we get into difficulties. This is the gist of what the Buddha has pointed out to us. There is a certain depth in all what we tried to put across with the help of similes. There are some discourses which show that after the parinibbāna of the Buddha, Venerable Ānanda was highly esteemed by monks and nuns. So much so that when they attained arahanthood, they went and informed it to him. There is a particular discourse which reveals this fact very clearly. Once Venerable Ñāṇananda, addressing the monks at Gositarama, said that those monks and nuns who declare their attainments of arahanthood in his presence do so according to 4 normative factors. The path of practice they have followed comes under one or the other of the following 4 modes. 1. Samatha pubbangamaṃ vipassanaṃ bhaveti, develops insight preceded by calm or serenity. And as one goes on practicing insight meditation like this, the supramundane path arises, and by following it, one abandons fetters and latencies, thereby attaining arahanthood. 2. Vipassana pubbangamaṃ samathang bhaveti, develops calm preceded by insight. By this method, too, a monk or nun can do away with the fetters and latencies and attain arahanthood. 3. Samathancha vipassanancha yuganadhang bhaveti, develops both calm and insight together, like yoked bulls pulling together. By that method also one can accomplish the task. And 4. The 4th method is very peculiar, and its true significance is a problem to many scholars. In this context, Venerable Ñāṇananda brings up the case of a monk whose mind is in conflict due to restless thoughts. Bhikkhuno dhammuddhacha viggahita manasang hoti. But then he says, there comes a time when his mind becomes settled within, gets one-pointed and concentrated. It is then that the supramundane path arises, which he successfully follows to attain arahanthood. It is very likely that here Venerable Ñāṇananda is speaking out of his own experience. He had hit upon a special method by fluke. The usual mode of practice is classified under 3 headings. 1. Developing insight preceded by calm. 2. Developing calm preceded by insight. 3. Developing both calm and insight together, like yoked bulls pulling together. The 4th method, which has remained a problem, most probably exemplifies Venerable Ñāṇanda's own attainment. Because of his restless thoughts regarding the attainment as a qualification for attending the council, he could not attain arahanthood. But there came a time when his mind got settled at that posture junction between sitting and lying down. This exceptional method he learned by a happy accident shows the depth of this Dhamma. We are taking pains to explain all this because quite a lot of misconceptions and wrong views about Nibbāna are rampant in the world today, due to a lack of understanding of the depth of this subject. In fact, I think the Brahmins of the Buddha's time knew more about what the Buddha was speaking of than many Buddhist scholars today. Those Brahmins knew full well that the Nibbāna preached by the Buddha had nothing in it to bolster up the craving for existence, that it meant the cessation of existence. Only thing, they viewed it as tantamount to annihilation. That was their mistake. According to the Buddha, there is no real self or soul to be annihilated. This is all what the Buddha proclaimed. Formerly, as now, I make known a suffering and its cessation. Pubbe chahang etarahi cha dukkhancheva panyapemi dukkhassa cha nirodhang. This much we pointed out. What remains to be abandoned last of all is the basic postulate of existence, namely, that lingering notion, that conceit, I am. There is a significant discourse in the Khandha Sangyutta of the Sangyutta Nikaya, which reveals the subtleness of the path from non-returnership to arahanthood. On a former occasion, too, we brought it up. It is the Khemaka Sutta. It records a sequence of events as follows. A group of elder monks were dwelling at Ghositarama in Kosambi. A monk named Khemaka, who was sick, was dwelling at Paṭicca in Kosambi itself. Those elders asked a monk named Dasaka to go and inquire about the health of that sick monk. When Dasaka went and inquired, Venerable Khemaka told him that he is seriously ill and that pains are increasing. When Venerable Dasaka brought that news, the elder monks asked him to go there again and ask Venerable Khemaka whether he regards any of the 5 aggregates of grasping, form, feeling, perception, preparations, and consciousness as this is mine, this am I, and this is myself. Venerable Dasaka did as he was instructed, and Venerable Khemaka answered, Friend, in regard to these 5 aggregates of grasping, I do not look upon any one of them as mine or myself, but I am not an influx-free Arahant. I have the notion I am in regard to these 5, but I do not look upon any of them as this am I. When Venerable Dasaka went and reported Venerable Khemaka's explanation to the elders, they were still puzzled and sent back Venerable Dasaka to get further clarification. This time, on hearing Venerable Dasaka's request for clarification, Venerable Khemaka said, Enough, friend, Dasaka. What is the use of running up and down? Get me my walking stick. I will myself go and see those elders. So he went with his walking stick to the elders and explained, What I said is true. I am not an Arahant, but this is my position. I do not see any of the aggregates as mine, but I have a residual subtle conceit, I am, a subtle desire, I am. Then he gives a simile. Just as, friends, there is smell in a blue or red or white lotus, whoever says that the smell comes from the petal, or from the color, or from the filament, is he speaking rightly? No, friend. Then how can one explain it rightly? One has to say that it is the smell of the flower. That is all one can say about it. Even so, friend, I do not see any of the aggregates as myself. However, there is in me a subtle conceit as I am. Though there is that conceit, he illustrates the subtleness of the 5 higher fetters of a monk who has cut off the 5 lower fetters by the above simile of the smell of the flower. Then he says, as that monk who is a non-returner goes on attending to the rise and fall of the 5 aggregates, there comes a time when even that residual conceit gets worn out. Then he gives a simile for it. Someone has a dirty cloth. He gives it to the washerman to clean. They clean it with some soap-like substance and return it to the owner. Though the cloth is now clean, it has the odor of the substance used to clean it. The owner puts it away in his wardrobe for the time being. But after some time, even that odor is gone. In the same way, by constant contemplation of the 5 aggregates with insight, even that residual conceit is eradicated, and one attains arahanthood. The extraordinary thing about this reasoned explanation by Venerable Khemaka is that, on hearing it, all the 60 monks who listened to him became arahants, and he himself attained arahanthood by intuiting into his own insightful explanation. There is such a subtle aspect in this question of language in the context of Nibbāna. We do not make use of the linguistic medium like that cleaning agent. We often use a couple of words, relative and pragmatic, to describe the middle path principle involved. In the Buddha's middle path, there is neither an absolute negation nor an absolute affirmation. Instead, there is a systematic procedure of choosing and using with an awareness of relative validity. Sometimes the Buddha would sum up a discourse with this grand finale, epitomizing the basic principle underlying his extraordinary middle path technique. Itikho bhikkhave dhammava dhamme abhisandenti dhammava dhamme paripurenti apara parang gamanaya. Though we say, I am going from this shore to the farther shore, in the end, there is no talk about an I. According to the Buddha, what we have in this dispensation is just this. Thus, O monks, mere phenomena flow into other phenomena. Mere phenomena fulfill other phenomena for the purpose of passing from the not beyond to the beyond. So we have now given you some deep points to ponder, all relevant to the law of dependent arising. Just think about the depth of the constituents of name and form, what we told about manasikara or attention. It is a doing within the mind, manasikara. What the Buddha has presented in the Mulapariyaya Sutta is a list of those things pertaining to that attention. If you don't adjust your viewpoint in accordance with right view, you are setting off on a path not towards Nibbāna, but opposite to it. Therefore, I hope you all will make use of this sermon for adjusting your viewpoint. We shall be presenting more facts on dependent arising in this series from various sources. We happen to quote several times the dictum, He who sees dependent arising sees the Dhamma. You had better remember it and take heart to tread this path of Dhamma. To clarify these points for yourselves, you should constantly dwell on the impermanence of the five aggregates. As you go on doing it, you can proceed on the path of insight, provided you have a clear understanding of name and form. Mere listening is not enough. You should apply these teachings to your own lives. The five aggregates are there with you, not somewhere else. With radical attention, you should always attend to your ins and outs, seeing their rise and fall, udayabhaya, as keenly as possible. You should understand the aggregates for what they are. That is what is known as knowledge of things as they are. Yatha bhuta ñāna. I hope you will find this sermon too helpful to your meditation. May you all be able to develop both calm and insight, drawing inspiration from this sermon, backed by the precepts observed and the meditation done today, and attain the goal of your endeavors in this very life. Whatever beings there are from the lowest hell to the highest Brahma world, may they rejoice in our sermon. May the merits acquired thereby conduce to the fulfillment of their higher aims. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.